Hello, and welcome to our podcast, episode number 30. The terrifying true story of three filmmakers lost in a cursed woods. I'm Timothy, and I am here with my good friend Thomas. Tonight, we're going to talk about Blair Witch Project. Be aware, spoilers ahead. Blair Witch Project is a 1999 American supernatural horror film about three students. Filmmakers who disappear while hiking in the Black Hills near Burkittsville, Maryland, to document the legend of the Blair Witch. Their footage and equipment are found a year later. Well, Tom, so did you enjoy Blair Witch Project?
I did enjoy Blair Witch Project, actually, Timothy. I found it quite intriguing and suspenseful. It's one of those films that really gets under your skin with its use of atmosphere and uncertainty. The way they used handheld cameras to create a sense of immersion was also very well done, in my opinion.
I have to admit that I did not enjoy it quite as much as you did, Tom. It felt like a lot of unnecessary screaming and running around for no reason to me. The story could have been told more effectively without all the jumpy camera work and loud noises.
Well, Tim, I think that's what makes it so effective. You see, when you're not sure what's lurking in the shadows or if there's something supernatural going on, every sound and movement feels that much more terrifying. The filmmakers behind this movie did an excellent job of creating an atmosphere of dread and uncertainty.
I guess I just prefer my horror movies with a bit more substance and logic to them. It felt like they were trying too hard to be scary rather than actually telling a coherent story. And don't even get me started on the ending.
Well, I can see where you're coming from with that, Timothy. However, I think it's important to remember that this movie was made during a time when found footage horror was still relatively new and innovative. It's easy to forget just how impactful this film was when it first came out because of the countless imitators that followed in its wake. But if you look past some of the more superficial aspects, like the shaky camera work, I think there's a solid story here about three people who get lost and slowly descend into madness due to the mysterious forces at work in the woods.
I'll give you that, Tom. But even still, it doesn't change my opinion of how poorly executed it was. It felt like they were more focused on creating jump scares than actually building up any kind of tension or suspense. And don't get me started on the characters. They were all so annoying and unlikable that I found myself rooting for whatever was in the woods to just put them out of their misery.
Now we come to my favorite part about this movie, Timothy. The characters. I think they did a great job of making these characters feel real and relatable. They're not perfect. They make mistakes and argue with each other like any group of friends would in that situation. And isn't that what makes horror movies so much scarier? It's when you can see yourself or your friends in the situations the characters are going through. That adds an extra layer of realism and fear to the story.
I guess that's one way of looking at it, Tom. But for me, it just seemed like they were trying too hard to make them feel real and relatable that they ended up being irritating and frustrating instead. I found myself wishing the characters would stop arguing and start working together to find their way out of the woods.
Well. Maybe that's because you prefer your horror protagonists to be more like Jason Voorhees or Michael Myers, silent, unstoppable killing machines. But in this case, I think the characters' humanity and vulnerability are what make them so frightening. They're not some invincible monster. They're just ordinary people who find themselves in an extraordinary situation. And it's that relatability that makes us fear for their safety even more.
Well, maybe you have a point there, Tom. But I still can't help but feel like there were better ways to tell this story without resorting to such annoying characters. And don't get me wrong, I love a good found footage horror movie as much as the next guy. But Blair Witch Project just didn't do it for me.
Well, you know what they say, Tim. Opinions are like elbows. Everyone has them, and some of us use them more than others. But seriously, though, I understand where you're coming from. And that's one of the best things about movies. We can all have our own interpretations and preferences. And even if we don't always agree on every aspect of a film or TV show, it's still fun to discuss them with friends like you.
Well said, Tom, well said.
Now let's move on to some interesting trivia about this movie.
Did you know that Blair Witch Project was actually shot using 16mm? Film stock and not digital cameras like most people assume. This decision added to the realism of the footage since it made it look more authentic and less like a traditional Hollywood production. Another interesting fact is that all three main actors were non-professionals who were cast through an intense audition process where they had to prove their ability to improvise under pressure. This decision contributed greatly to the film's sense of realism, since it made the characters feel more genuine and less like caricatures or stereotypes typically found in horror movies. Additionally, Blair Witch Project was famously marketed using a viral campaign that fooled many people into thinking the events depicted in the movie were real. This included a website with detailed information about the legend of the Blair Witch and even fake news articles reporting on the missing filmmakers. The result was an incredible amount of buzz around the film before it was even released, which helped contribute to its eventual success at the box office.
Those are some really interesting tidbits about Blair Witch Project, Timothy. I especially love how they casted non-professionals for the lead roles and marketed the film using a viral campaign. It just goes to show that sometimes taking risks can pay off big time in Hollywood. Now, let's talk about our favorite scenes from this movie. Mine has got to be when Heather finds those weird stick figures hanging from trees in the woods. That scene gave me chills when I first saw it back in '99. What about you, Tim? Do you have a favorite scene or moment from Blair Witch Project?
Well, Tom, while I didn't enjoy the movie as much as you did, there were some scenes that stood out to me. One of my favorites was when they stumbled upon that old house in the woods and found all those weird dolls hanging from the ceiling. It had this really creepy vibe to it that kind of stuck with me even after watching the movie. Another scene I liked was near the end when Mike finally snaps and starts screaming at Heather about how they're all going to die. It was intense and unexpected, which is something I appreciate in horror movies. But overall, Blair Witch Project wasn't really my cup of tea.
Well, Timothy, I can see how those scenes might have stuck with you even if you didn't enjoy the movie as a whole. And you're right about the special effects and filming techniques playing a huge role in creating that sense of unease and tension throughout Blair Witch Project. For instance, the way they used practical effects for the creature or monster was really effective because it left much more to the imagination than if they had gone with a CGI or animatronic version. This also added to the realism since it felt like something truly supernatural and unexplainable could be lurking in those woods. Additionally, their use of long takes and extended shots created this feeling of claustrophobia and confinement, which heightened the suspense even further.
I agree with you there, Tom. The practical effects were definitely a breath of fresh air compared to what we see in modern horror movies where everything is CG. And using long takes and extended shots was an interesting choice that added to the overall atmosphere of dread and uncertainty. It made me feel like I was right there with them in those woods, experiencing their fear firsthand.
Absolutely. And another thing they did really well was use natural lighting for most of the film. This not only helped create a more authentic feeling, but also added to the unsettling nature of the Story, because you never knew when darkness would fall or what might be lurking in the shadows. It's almost as if nature itself was conspiring against these poor, unsuspecting filmmakers.
That's a really interesting point, Tom. I hadn't thought about it that way before. Using natural lighting definitely added to the overall sense of realism and tension in Blair Witch Project. It almost felt like you were watching a home video instead of a traditional horror film, which made it all the more unsettling.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the reasons why Blair Witch Project was so successful. It broke away from traditional horror movie tropes and conventions by using innovative filming techniques and storytelling devices that kept audiences on their toes throughout its entire runtime. It proved that you don't need big budgets or special effects to create an effective horror experience. All you really need are good story, interesting characters, and some talented filmmakers behind the camera.
Well said, Tom. I think Blair Witch Project is definitely a classic in its own right, even if it's not my personal favorite horror movie of all time. It's interesting to see how influential this film has been on subsequent found footage and supernatural horror movies that have come out since then. And who knows?
Maybe one day I'll revisit it and find something new to appreciate about it.
You never know, Tim. Sometimes our opinions can change over time as we gain new perspectives or experiences in life. And hey, even if you don't end up loving Blair Witch Project any more than you did before, at least you can say that you tried it and didn't like it, which is better than never having given it a chance.
Well, Tom, since we're on the subject of Blair Witch Project, let's talk a bit more about the actors and their characters in this film. I have to admit that the three leads, Heather Donahue, Michael C. Williams, and Joshua Leonard,
Really did an amazing job with the material they were given.
they all brought a sense of authenticity and vulnerability to their roles that made it easy for the audience to connect with them, even if we didn't necessarily like their characters very much. Heather Donahue played Heather, the one who was filming most of the time, and she did an excellent job of portraying a relatable young woman who was determined to finish what she started, even in the face of terrifying circumstances. Michael C. Williams as Mike provided some much-needed comic relief throughout the movie, with his sarcastic comments and nervous demeanor, which made him both likable and annoying at times. Lastly, Joshua Leonard played the role of Josh, who was generally more level-headed than Heather or Mike, but also struggled to maintain his composure in the face of their growing paranoia and fear.
I completely agree with you there, Timothy. All three actors did an incredible job portraying their characters' descent into madness throughout Blair Witch Project. And it really speaks volumes about their talents that they were able to make us feel so invested in these people, even though we couldn't stand them at times. One of the things I find particularly interesting about Heather is her transformation from being initially skeptical about the legend of the Blair Witch to becoming increasingly consumed by fear and paranoia as their journey progresses. It's almost like she becomes a different person entirely under the influence of whatever supernatural force is at work in those woods. As for Mike, I think his character provides an important contrast to Heather's growing hysteria. His constant joking around and attempts at keeping things light-hearted are both endearing and infuriating, which makes him a very complex and nuanced character. And finally, Josh serves as the voice of reason for much of the movie until he eventually succumbs to the same paranoia that plagues his friends.
That's a really good point, Tom. All three actors did an amazing job portraying their characters' arcs throughout the film. It's easy to see why Blair Witch Project was such a groundbreaking movie in terms of its use of found footage and storytelling techniques when you consider how well these actors were able to bring their characters to life. Even though I didn't personally enjoy the film as much as you did, I can definitely appreciate the talent that went into creating it. And who knows? Maybe one day I'll give it another chance and discover something new about it that I missed before.
Indeed, Timothy. As we mentioned earlier, Blair Witch Project was incredibly influential on subsequent found footage and supernatural horror movies that came out in its wake. Some notable examples of films that were directly influenced by Blair Witch Project include Paranormal Activity, Chronicle, and Unfriended. These movies all shared similarities with Blair Witch Project in terms of their use of found footage, minimalist storytelling, and focus on relatable characters being terrorized by unseen forces. One film that stands out as a particularly interesting example of Blair Witch Project's influence is Cloverfield. Although not a found footage movie like Blair Witch Project, Cloverfield utilizes many of the same techniques such as shaky camera work and an unseen monster to create a sense of claustrophobia and unease. The film's marketing campaign was also heavily inspired by Blair Witch Project's viral approach, with cryptic trailers and websites designed to create buzz around the movie before its release. Another interesting aspect of Blair Witch Project's influence can be seen in television shows like The X-Files and Supernatural. Both series feature characters who investigate supernatural occurrences and often use found footage or pseudo-found footage elements to tell their stories. This emphasis on grounded, relatable characters dealing with otherworldly terror is another legacy that Blair Witch Project has left behind in the world of popular entertainment.
I have to agree with you there, Tom. It's amazing how much impact one movie can have on an entire genre. And it's not just horror films that were influenced by Blair Witch Project either. We've seen found footage elements creep into all sorts of different genres over the years, from sci-fi to drama to even comedy. It really goes to show how effective this filmmaking technique can be when done right.
Mm-hmm.
One interesting example of a non-horror movie that used found footage to great effect is the 2014 film The Guest. While not as overtly terrifying as Blair Witch Project, The Guest uses similar techniques like POF shots and shaky camera work to create tension and unease throughout its runtime. It's also worth mentioning that there have been numerous parodies and homages to Blair Witch Project over the years, including a hilarious sketch on Saturday Night Live, where Will Ferrell and Chris Cotton spoofed the movie by setting up shop in their own backyard to shoot their own found footage horror flick.
Mm.
Another interesting development is the recent rise of reality television. Shows that blur the lines between fiction and nonfiction. Shows like The Hills, New Beginnings, and Keeping Up with the Kardashians have been accused of using similar techniques to create dramatic tension and suspense, which could be seen as a continuation of Blair Witch Project's legacy in found footage storytelling.
That's an interesting point you bring up about reality television shows, Tim. I never really thought about it that way before. It seems like the popularity of found footage films and reality TV has kind of gone hand in hand over the years. And who knows? Maybe one day we'll see a full-fledged horror movie that's presented as a reality show within its own narrative universe. That could be pretty mind-blowing. As for other TV series that have been influenced by Blair Witch Project, I would say shows like The Walking Dead and Stranger Things are good examples. Both of these series feature small groups of characters navigating dangerous, and mysterious worlds filled with supernatural forces and unseen threats. They also share a similar aesthetic to Blair Witch Project in terms of their use of practical effects, long takes, and extended shots that create tension and suspense.
That's true, Tom. It's amazing how much influence Blair Witch Project has had on the entertainment industry as a whole. And I have to agree with you about Stranger Things. That show is definitely inspired by this movie, in terms of storytelling and characters. As for me, it's very reminiscent of the Gunai movie, but it's still a great show that people enjoy watching.
Indeed, Tim. And speaking of other influential movies, there are several others that came out after Blair Witch Project. For example, Paranormal Activity is another found footage horror movie that used similar techniques and storytelling to Blair Witch Project. It's also about a group of friends trying to find the truth behind mysterious events. But they use their relationship with their parents and start uncover strange things happening around them when they move into a new house with their father in an old family. Now, let's discussing TV series that uses found footage cameras to shoot. Blair Witch Project inspired YouTube channel called Para, the friends who talk about the same movie industry. This movie podcast and TV series where they decided to make a list of their own found footage of films that they have been influenced by trying to discussing movies for each other movies as they work in the entertainment on a similar techniques and TV series while watching the show business.
Well, Tom, I think we've certainly covered a lot of ground when it comes to discussing Blair Witch Project and its impact on the film industry. It's amazing how influential this movie has been over the years. As for my final thoughts on it, I still don't think it's a personal favorite of mine, but I can definitely appreciate the talent that went into creating it. The acting was top-notch, and the use of found footage and natural lighting added an extra layer of realism to the story that made it all the more unsettling. It's definitely one of those movies where you can see why it became such a cultural phenomenon upon its release.
I completely agree with you there, Tim. Blair Witch Project is truly a groundbreaking film in many ways. And even though it might not be everyone's cup of tea, it's hard to deny the impact it's had on modern cinema. It's opened doors for all sorts of new storytelling techniques and has inspired countless filmmakers over the years. So, as we wrap up this discussion, I just want to say thank you to everyone who joined us today. We hope you enjoyed our take on Blair Witch Project. And if you did, please make sure to like, subscribe, and comment below with your own thoughts on the film or any other found footage horror movies that have caught your eye. And don't forget to hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode of our podcast. Until next time, this has been Tim and Tom, signing off from another lively discussion about all things film related.